Welcome to this episode of Against the Mountains of Madness. I'm your host, Jason Rennie. Joining me as usual is...
And I'm John C. Wright.
And we have a special guest today, Alexander Macris, role-playing game designer, comic book creator, founder of The Escapist, and local man of mystery. So...
he has not yet reached the level of an international man of mystery. He's working his way up.
That's correct. It's a process. It's a process. You know.
So, on this episode, we're going to discuss the topic of the unseen war. So, the unseen war.
Greetings, world. This is John C. Wright. I and my compatriot, Jason Rennie, take up arms weekly against the mountains of madness that are afflicting and overwhelming the modern age. You are welcome here among like-minded souls, and I hope we have provided a work of insight, hope, or humor, and perhaps an explanation of the insanity that is the modern age. For more content and conversation on these and other fascinating topics of philosophy, science fiction, and current events, please visit our Substack at atmom.substack.com. Tips, bribes, and generous patronage are warmly encouraged. Thank you. Mr. Macris, and I have to disclose that I used to work for him, so that so I have a personal relationship with him. What makes you think, if you do think, that this war has a spiritual component, that it's not just like every other social confusion or convulsion that's happened before this time?
Well, like you, I was an atheist for much of my adult life. And so I think, if you had asked me this 10 years ago, I would have laughed at the notion that there was a spiritual component to anything that was happening. Over time, I started to become more open to, I would say, spiritual answers to questions. It was based partly on some experiences that friends had that very profoundly changed them, you included, my wife had, as well as a kind of dissatisfaction with the materialist, reductionist answers that we get to really pressing questions that sort of require us to believe in ever-increasing levels of absurdity, infinite numbers of multiverses, et cetera, with no evidence thereof, other than the fact that they have to exist because otherwise God would exist. So that, in turn, led me into reading theology. And I think you can empathize with this, John, because you did the same thing. You said, well, I wonder what the correct religion is, and you started doing a lot of reading to decide. And I started doing the same thing, and I ended up reading a lot of theodicy, because one of the things that had driven me to atheism in the first place was that I couldn't find a good answer to the question of evil. Mm-hmm. And I eventually stumbled on what is called warfare theodicy, and was surprised at how explanatory it was.
What was the warfare? Let me interrupt. What was the warfare theodicy? What is that idea?
Mm.
Okay, so warfare theodicy is the idea that God is not responsible for evil. God does not use evil to punish us or cause us to suffer in order to level up, but rather that God is opposed by an evil force who is directly responsible for evil. And so people who are victims of tragic circumstances or horrible events, it's not God's will, it's their casualties in a spiritual battlefield. And I found that to be a much more believable theodicy than any of the others that I encountered, more than the Augustinian, more than the Iranian. And this was developed by a guy named Greg Boyd. He's a pastor, I believe, up in Minnesota. And he's written extensively on the warfare theodicy, and with both biblical support as well as sort of general theological explanation of why he believes it's the case. I then separately, through separate reading, encountered the same concept in the Middle Platonists, specifically Plutarch, and then I encountered the same concept again in the traditionalists of Guinan and Evola. And all of them were basically saying the same thing, like there's a spiritual war, and you can't blame God for evil, but rather you have to understand God is fighting the evil, and so are you, or you're teaming up with the evil.
But if I may pester you with a question, what makes you think that the current culture war, is a spiritual war as opposed to merely a human event in human history that's taking place for human reasons and can be explained by a materialist explanation? Because I don't think the human experience explanation fits, but I wondered if you also thought it did not fit.
Yeah. Let me answer that. Sure.
Okay, go ahead.
So, one of the things that people often say is, look, you can understand what's going on in the world just based on greed, right? Corporations want to make money, and so, they're doing the things they want to do to make money. But I worked in Hollywood, right? I literally had an office in Beverly Hills on Wilshire Boulevard working in Hollywood. And I can tell you that it was not the case that their decisions were motivated by greed. For instance, when I was working in Hollywood, I was given charge of a division of the company, which included a website called Break.com. And Break.com had been failing for many years. Its traffic had just been going down, and no one could figure out why, because it used to be so popular. And I said, well, obviously, the reason why is that it used to be really funny, directed at men and men's humor. And now you guys have sort of turned it into, kind of this feel-good feminist hippie site. And that's not what dudes want. So I said, we're going to aim for heartland American males. We're going to have hilarious memes about beer and trucks and hunting. And we're going to have crazy viral videos from the internet of like firefighters saving 16 people and all this stuff. And I built a team to find and make that kind of content. And within a year, we were single-handedly, my division was doing more traffic than the whole rest of the company put together. And I blew past so many of my success metrics that they had to give me a bonus that was more than my entire base salary because they had just never expected anyone could do it.
Nice.
So then comes my performance review, and I expect to get promoted. And instead, I got told that my editorial sensibilities don't match with the company's values. And my reaction was, well, what is your value? Failure? Like, is it, because yes, you're right, that's not my value. And their reaction was, well, it's just, the audience you've built, a lot of people think, it's, and I'm like, Republican? And they kind of wouldn't answer me because it would be illegal to discriminate on that basis. But the writing was on the wall. Like, I got passed over for promotion. They redid my contract to get rid of the chance of bonus and, defunded us, even though we were the most successful, most profitable division. So I quit that company, and they went out of business, continuing to do those sort of tactics. They literally went bankrupt a year later.
So, if I may, you have direct experience from the horse's mouth that their values were more important to them than their materialism, than their money.
Yes.
So
That's
love
correct.
of money cannot be the motivation for the things we are seeing, for the decisions we are seeing being made by companies.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, first-hand experience. Like, I couldn't be more persuaded of this truth. And I've seen it over and over and over again. You can see it so vividly in pop culture where every day there's another content creator coming forward and just talking about how he has total contempt for his audience and he doesn't want to serve them. We saw it in game journalism when 12 game journalist sites simultaneously announced that gamers are dead. Well, if gamers are dead, who exactly do you think you're going to appeal to, you morons? And of course, all of those websites went out of business. Why? Well, because they drove away their audience for the sake of their values. So then...
and also
so
because the devil breaks the tools that he uses once he uses them. He doesn't care for his sheep, his sons, his people don't get any benefit from him. If I may, that's why I think it's a spiritual warfare, because I think the behavior can't be explained or understood otherwise.
Yeah.
I would note, just you say their values. These people are definitely at war with the good, the true, and the beautiful as well. So, that without question, they produce ugly, awful, false things.
They produced She-Hulk.
They produced She-Hulk. Yes, they produced
Ugly.
Ant-Man Quantumania. They produced Captain Marvel. They produced Miss Marvel. Ugh. I mean, that's just
Ugly.
Marvel.
That's right.
It's not, and so your theory is that it's not the true, it's not the good, it's not the beautiful. It's not beautiful because they're not trying to appeal to. They're trying to desexualize their female stars these days.
Yeah, they are. So there's this blogger I read named Bruce Charlton, who is kind of like a polymathic genius. He used to be a medical doctor. He's done evolutionary biology, and now in his retirement, he's become a theological blogger.
He wrote a book called Thought Prison.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
I know him.
Okay.
I've corresponded with him. Brilliant man.
Oh yeah.
Brilliant man.
Yeah, brilliant man. Yeah. So Bruce says there's 3 types of evil. He says there's Luciferian evil, Ahrimanic evil, and Seraphic evil. So Luciferian evil is evil for the sake of the pursuit of wicked pleasure. Okay. Ahrimanic evil is evil for the pursuit of worldly domination, and then Seraphic evil is evil in the pursuit of destruction for the sake of destruction. And his argument is that both the Ahrimanic and the Luciferian path ultimately lead to the Seraphic path, and that as society evolves through stages of evil, destruction for the sake of destruction becomes the inevitable goal. For instance, announcing to a planet of carbon-based life forms that carbon is a pollutant would be an example of a sort of logical outcome of destruction, I think.
The first kind of evil is the evil of Blackbeard the pirate, who just wants to loot and ravish and take things. And the last type of evil is the evil of the Joker by Heath Ledger in the Nolan movie, where some people just want to see the world burn.
That's right. And I myself have, considerable, shall we say, susceptibility or sympathy to the Luciferian evil, the Blackbeard the pirate evil. I mean, in many ways, my role-playing game, Adventure Conquer King, certainly caters to that, fantasy of conquest and crushing the jeweled thrones of the earth beneath your sandaled tread and so on. But it's interesting to see, to me, how far we've progressed past that, right? Like, as you said, we've moved past them sexualizing to desexualizing. It's very interesting.
You quoted a line from Robert E. Howard's Conan. And Conan is an anti-hero, which is a polite way of saying he's a villain. But he's kind of a likable villain because we all occasionally feel the impulse to shatter civilization because civilization's kind of annoying. It has rules that we have to obey.
Yep.
But you couldn't make the Conan movie these days because the man is too handsome and manly, and the women are too gorgeous. They're all these barbarian, half-clad warrior princesses and so on and so forth. And I have to say, even when they make a Cleopatra documentary on Netflix, they have to put a sword in the hand of the woman because heaven forbid that she actually be female or feminine.
Yeah, that's right. My wife complains about this all the time, that she's a very feminine woman, and she literally cannot find a TV show that presents a woman who succeeds on the strength of her femininity, right? It's always they succeed by acting like men.
You can't even find a show that's got a vamp who succeeds because she's a femme fatale, like in some film noir movie starring Lauren Bacall.
Yep. Exactly.
Jason, you had an anecdote about some horror that happened on the sexual matter.
Well, I was struck recently. One of the things that made me sort of ponder what it must be like to be a right-wing atheist today. A man a trans woman was admitted to a women's domestic violence shelter, where he proceeded to assault some of the women there, and was arrested and then put in a women's prison or a women's holding facility, where he proceeded to do it again. This is insane. This makes absolutely no sense to me. How do you look at that and go, oh, this is just crazy people being crazy? This is just people being odd. This is psychotically evil, and feminists cheer on and want more of this behavior. Right. It's just, how do you look at what's going on and go, no, this isn't a spiritual war?
Yeah. Now, on that note, I recently read a book by Julius Evola in which he discusses what he calls the occult war. And he actually, in that book, which was written in the 1930s, lays out the tactics of the occult war. This is how the spiritual forces, he calls them the subtle inferior forces, will influence us. And he lays it out. And this is before anyone had developed the concept of preference falsification. This was before people knew about CIA tactics. This is before people had fully come to understand memes. Like, he's writing way before all of this. And his book that he wrote in the 1930s is the best explanation of the sort of tactics that we see shaping our world that I've ever read. And that was another big reason that I started to believe that there was a spiritual component here, because it had so much explanatory power for what we were seeing.
Since I'm shallower than you, I have to say my book that explained everything was also written right after the war, and it's That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis. Even though it's fiction, he foresaw and explained everything. But I have to admit, he did not explain the tactics being used, which were studied very intensely, very scientifically studied, the tactics of mass psychology, of mass deception, by the Nazis and by the communists, and they have it down to a science, and it's now being used on us.
It absolutely is. Yeah. So I'm actually going to pull it up real quick, because here are the 9 tactics of occult warfare, which is the tactic of scientific suggestion, the tactic of replacement, the tactic of counterfeit, the tactic of inversion, the tactic of ricochet, tactic of scapegoating, tactic of delusion, tactic of deliberate misidentification, and the tactic of replacing infiltration. And, so he just goes through how all of these methods play out, and it's very explanatory. Now, I haven't read this Hideous Strength. It's on my reading list, so I will take this podcast as my call to.
I will also therefore recommend that you read his nonfiction version of the exact same idea, which appears in The Abolition of Man. May I interrupt to say that that's a great idea that I've used in some of my science fiction stories also. The devils like it when you don't draw wards, when you don't get holy water at hand to drive back the vampires and stuff. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, C.S. Lewis, was it in the Screwtape Letters, Screwtape talks exactly about that, going, we're working towards our perfect creation, the materialist magician who can employ occult forces, but he thinks it's scientific, and so he won't look too closely, and will be, so they'll use all the occult forces, they will call on us just like we want, but they'll do it without realizing what they're doing, so it'll work out for us.
Yes.
Yes. Anyway, sorry, please continue.
All right, so the tactic of replacement is used when there's a danger that people are waking up because some of the ideas that the occult forces are relying on have lost their power of suggestion. And nowadays, we call the tactic of replacement, we call it the modified limited hangout, which is in the modified limited hangout, you admit some of the truth, then you mix in misinformation in order to misdirect the audience. So, for instance, imagine that people actually spot let's say they actually spot angels, and the government wants to conceal that. And so instead, they assert that they are unidentified aerial phenomenon which they're investigating.
I was going to say weather balloons, but...
Yeah. Okay, so then the tactic of counterfeits is when you realize you're starting to encounter an awakening, and you therefore come up with a counterfeit ideology that will contain the people. So, for instance, a great example of the tactic of counterfeit is the mainstream Republican Party.
Yep.
Which says many of the things that they should be saying, but, is not actually a truly conservative party in many ways. Another example, though, from another side would be how after the 2008 bailouts, when there were all the protests happening in Manhattan about, the bailouts for the financiers, that's when woke capitalism suddenly emerges, right? That's when suddenly everybody becomes socially justice-oriented and multicultural, and it's to just dissuade people from pursuing the class.
I remember early on when that was happening. Tim Pool was on the ground, and he was saying initially there were libertarians there and conservatives, and everybody was together against the bankers who were the problem. And then that changed, and the mental patients, that too rude, turned up, and it just went insane, and it went sort of hard left social justice. madness.
Yeah.
But the point is
Right.
that the tactic allowed the bankers to continue getting money from the government, and for the government to continue making the bank part of their power structure.
Right.
So, a successful maneuver in that case.
Oh, yeah.
Very successful. Yeah. So the next up is the tactic of inversion. And so the tactic of inversion is when you see that people might be shifting to some sort of spiritual awakening. You create fake or pseudo spiritual forms that invert the actual message of the real religion.
I got to say that's a
so-
very old tactic, because there's a heresy called Gnosticism, which basically says that the God is the devil and the devil is God, which is
Right. That's right.
Marx has a kind of a materialistic economic version of the exact same approach, the same thinking.
Yes. Let's see. The tactic of ricochet is when, for instance, you look at a potential group which could be an ally to the group you want to keep down, and so you convince them that other group is actually their mortal enemies. And a great example would be as follows. In the 1930s, René Guénon, who was a European philosopher and thinker, converted to Islam because he thought Sufi Islam was the most effective spiritual tradition that was still open. And a lot of people today talk about how there's, quote, an American Taliban that agrees with Muslims on many issues, and how the Democratic Party is turning against Islam because of its views on gay marriage and things like that. And so then if you apply this tactic, you would say that the sort of war on terror might have been a tactic of ricochet. Okay. Then the tactic of scapegoating, of course, well known. It's simply, you put someone up who's to blame, who's not actually to blame.
You blame the Jews. That's is basically it. And if they're not around, you blame the whites, or you blame the straights, or you blame the Christians.
Yeah, exactly. So
that's one, if I may
then,
interrupt, that's one that I call the theory of original sin. Each one of these groups
Yeah.
has a different theory of original sin. They never blame the sons of Adam, that's to say mankind, for mankind's ills. They always take this one group and say they're the ones responsible for every evil in the world, including global warming. They're destroying the weather. So if we just get rid of that group, if we just eliminate them, then utopia will erupt spontaneously.
It's so simple.
Then they do
right?
everything that... It's so simple. And then you do everything you can that would prevent peace, order, and the other things you want from utopia from ever happening. You immediately act dysutopian to get rid of the scapegoats.
That's right. So the tactic of dilution is when you advance an idea by reformulating it in an innocuous way, but it has the same subversive outcomes. Communists were excellent at the tactic.
Also, expanding the definition of marriage to include things that are not marriage is an example of delusion. It makes it something that's no longer sacrament, no longer taken seriously.
Right. Yep. Okay. So then we've got the tactic of deliberate misidentification. So properly speaking, if you have a group and one of its members does something that betrays the group's values, then you would point out that person is a bad example of that group. So, for instance, if I am a world-renowned environmentalist, but you catch me going to the national forests and polluting them with aluminum cans, then you would say this person is behaving badly. The tactic of deliberate misidentification is to find a person who does that and then claim that therefore their entire group is bad. So, for instance, you find a Catholic priest who has abused children, and you say, so therefore Catholicism is bad.
I was going to say, you find a cop that commits an act of police brutality, and you say, all cops systematically do this.
Yes, that's right. And then the final one is the tactic of replacing infiltration. And this one, I think, has become really well known, because of the meme of the skin suit, where you...
Entryism.
So this one is really known. But as far as I know, Ebola was the first guy to identify the tactic of replacing infiltrations as a tactic. Obviously, it was being used before then, but he's the first one that laid it out. So, I mean, you got to hand it to the guy, right? Most people in the 1930s hadn't realized the extent to which these sort of tactics were going to be deployed widely and make such a difference. And certainly, you know, the ones that had figured it out were the ones doing it, and they were keeping it secret.
But surely any purely materialistic explanation would explain someone using those tactics. They're being used because they're effective. But I think all three of us believe that there is a clear spiritual component involved, some sort of supernal power which seems to come down on the one side or on the other in many major world events and any of the major movements here. If my question makes sense.
Well, it seems.
So why do we think the devil is the one, you know, doing these tactics?
It seems a little too organized.
Because I was going to say, I think partly there's a values issue. You can't use these tactics if you're committed to the good, the beautiful, and the true.
Of course.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because by definition they involve lying. So they are against truth, and to the extent that we equate truth, goodness, and beauty with God, then they are by definition anti-God practices, right? Counter-spiritual practices. Certainly someone like C.S. Lewis would, I think, see it that way, right? Like, you may not know or even realize you're working for the forces of evil, but you are nevertheless working for the forces of evil.
But the reason why I think it's spiritual is because the evil being done doesn't seem to have any human benefit to any of the evildoers. You started with an example of a company that penalized you for increasing their revenue. That means that, and they said our values are not in line with your behavior. So that means their value was not in making money. Their value was something else, and of course I would say a spiritual value. And the things that
I agree.
Okay. And I also have to mention that Mr. Rennie just said it's too organized. Why are the capitalists cooperating with the socialists to push woke corporate fascism? Why are the anarchists cooperating with the totalitarians? Why are the Islamics cooperating with the homosexuals? You know, you'd think that would not be a good. You would think the Jews for Palestine would not be a natural alliance of mutual interests. You know, you would think the socialist capitalists and the anarchist totalitarians would not be a natural commonality of interest. But the only commonality I can see is that they're all anti-Christian. They're all against the good, the true, and the beautiful.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, they're definitely anti-Christianity is widespread and accepted. It's not the only thing, though. You know, you've also just got, you know, anti-male, for instance, in many places, anti-European, et cetera, et cetera.
Because Europe was Christendom, and male is because our God is a father God.
It could. That's.
It's God as leader. It's man as leader. They hate. You say, it's the concept.
Right.
It's not particular men. Men are just the demiurge in their system. Men are just the people who create society to benefit men at the expense of women. And that kind of same paranoia is the same thing you see in Marx, where he says society was created by capitalists in order to benefit the capitalists at the expense of the proletarian. And so on and so forth.
So you're going to have stronger views on exactly what's happening than I am, because you've already sort of completed your study of the options and picked your faith team, and I'm still sort of going through the studying my options thing. So that's why I'm hedging my bets a little bit, because I don't necessarily think I have it figured out. Like, I'm not sure if it's Catholicism or Orthodoxy or who.
Come and join the Catholic Church. It's great. It took me a while to get there, but.
One of my very closest friends is a devout Catholic, and he took me to a Catholic Mass for Christmas. It was very beautiful.
Yeah, I love Christmas.
Our buildings are prettier.
Christmas. Yes,
our buildings are prettier than other people's buildings. So there is that. I mean, that can't be a coincidence.
My Hagia Sophia disagrees.
The Hagia Sophia is a Catholic building. It was erected when the
church.
Orthodox. Orthodox and Catholic had been the same until the year 1000 A.D. And
That's
the Hagia
true.
Sophia is older than that.
That's true.
So it's the unified church.
That's true, but I don't think it's fair to call it it's equally fair to say then that
sure.
all churches built before 1000 were
That's fair.
Orthodox.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Certainly,
We have just
perfectly fair. Perfectly fair.
Okay.
The tree was growing and the branches split. You know.
I was baptized Greek Orthodox, so I have to
Fair
defend
enough.
it. You know, there's only 1% of the American population, so it's easy to poop on us.
I've never heard anyone say anything bad about the Orthodox Church in America. You're too small.
Yeah.
You know, you didn't have the KKK hanging you. But I will tell you the reason why I became Catholic rather than some other denomination, if I can just interrupt the conversation for a personal anecdote. When I was an atheist, and I was a hardcore, vituperative, evangelistic atheist, I was actively trying to talk Christians into believing in godlessness. The madness of my own side became apparent to me, and the fact that they were saying crazy, crazy things, like that they wanted to remove "In God We Trust" from the money because it had some sort of magical effect on their thinking. It was a symbol, you see, and I thought atheists were people who didn't believe in magic, were the people who don't believe in the supernatural. So they just got crazier and crazier, and they started to say that they started to say that you should always indulge in whatever sexual appetite you thought best at the time.
Right.
Because if there's no God, there's no rules. But I, as a completely logical creature, said, but if there's no God, then there are rules, and they're the rules of logic, and logic says you can't act in your own self-detriment. You can't act self-destructively. And to bring children into this world without making provision for them is self-destructive. And to engage in the sexual act without making provision with your mate to take care of any children that may be produced also have to be planned for. That's just prudence. So slowly, one step at a time, and very much against my will, I came to the same conclusions that the Catholic Church came to, which is that divorce is unlawful and that contraception is a grave moral evil. And I was the only atheist I know who thought contraception was a bad idea, was a grave moral evil. And so when I changed my mind about, I was saved by the Lord because he came looking for me when I was trying to hide under a bush, quaking in fear. Okay, and the Holy Spirit was poured into me against my will. I didn't calculate out what to happen. A supernatural event happened to me like a thunderbolt. But afterwards, I still had to decide which denomination to go to if I was going to go to church on Sunday. You Christians had quarreled with each other, and all your churches weren't in the same spot, so I had to pick which one. And there I could only rely on my human wisdom because I didn't have another supernatural event happen to me. Well, I automatically eliminated any church that allowed for contraception or that allowed for divorce, because no Christian church before 1930 allowed for either of those things. The sheer antiquity of the ancient
Anglicans
church
were founded in divorce. As coming to the Anglican, as starting out in the Anglican Church as a Christian at age 18, it was definitely founded in divorce.
Anglicanism. All I'm saying is Anglicanism was not an option for me because I had atheist reasons independent of religious motivation.
Fair enough.
For thinking the teaching was correct and was the same as it had been traditionally throughout all time.
No, fair enough.
And that's, by the way, the other reason I think we're in a spiritual war is because the same forces which have attacking the church now are the ones that attacked the church 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, and 1,500 years ago. And they're almost, and the only thing that's different is the names. The people who are in favor of abortion are worshiping Moloch because they're sacrificing children. The people who are worshiping Asmodeus, the god of lust, say that you should do whatever you feel like doing, provided it provides you sexual pleasure. Even though it's destructive to them, Even though some of these people end up castrating children and mutilating them. Okay? Mammon, of course, the great god Mammon, is something that all Americans are familiar with. It's one of our it's one of our local tribal deities. And so on and so forth. These are all the ancient gods of old. These are all the devils of old that are plaguing us now.
Mm.
Yeah, there was a book about this actually. The return of the old gods, or the return of the strong gods, came out really recently. Goes into this at length. It's also on my reading list. And I would imagine you've either read it or you and the person think really similarly, because what you just described is like the back jacket cover.
We saw the same thing and came to the same conclusion. I've never read the book. It's on my list of books to read because people have recommended it to me.
Yeah. So I myself have never had any sort of spiritual experience. My wife has. Several of my friends have. Including you, John. I have not. So I really stumbled there strictly through science and philosophy and getting more and more frustrated. Like here was a big turning point for me. Was I was studying quantum physics, and you read a philosopher like a quantum physicist like Dr. Henry Stapp, and he talks about how there's a place for consciousness in quantum physics, and he talks about how quantum physics implies that there must be a universal mind. And I'm like, okay, that's really fascinating. So then I try and converse with some other physics-minded folks, and they'll say, "Oh well, that can't be true." Well, why can't it be true? Well, because that would mean that there's some sort of dualism, and dualism has been discredited. And I'm like, well, why is dualism discredited? And they say, well, because physics is causally closed. And I'm like, well, the whole point is that Henry Stapp is arguing that physics is not causally closed. So you can't assert causal closure as your argument against this being correct.
You also can't have the opinion of causal closure if things are causally closed, because the thing that made you think that is therefore not your volition. You weren't convinced logically.
That's right.
There's no any theory that eliminates the theoretician, I think, is a bad theory.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another great example of the sort of philosophical reasoning that led me to think, like, look, there has to be something more, because we're not. There was a philosopher named Edward Feser who
he was instrumental in my moving to the Catholic Church.
Okay, so he's been a really good blog to read, and I've read a bunch of his books. And he has this analogy where he talks about that science for years has been making great progress in sort of cleaning up the room of knowledge, but anytime it gets to some dust that it can't quite figure out,
under the carpet,
under the rug of consciousness.
Yep.
And he says, and then people that are fans of science will say, but we're going to tackle consciousness the same way we've been tackling the rest of these thorny problems. And he's like, you can't do that because you've literally been using consciousness as your dumping ground for the stuff you can't explain. So you're not going to be able to use those methods.
I really wish some of these physicists would at least take a Philosophy 101 course and read Plato, Aristotle, and Thomas Aquinas, if no one else, just to get certain fundamental basics about the four natures of causation, or the difference between teleology and mechanical causation, so they would stop saying such stupid things that a schoolboy can see through. They would stop merely uttering paradoxes where they themselves refute themselves with their own words, and they just can't see it. You can't study non-physical reality by means of empirical tools. Empiricism is the study of physical reality. It's the study of the regularity of nature, of things we see in the external world. You can't study consciousness by means of physics any more than you can. A man born blind since birth can study color. He doesn't have the tools to do it.
Right. So, which is another one that I've run into. So, imagine that you're colorblind and I'm not, right?
Sure.
And you tell me, you say, Alex, I don't see color. And I say, okay, I believe you, John. You don't see color. But if
except I would say, Mr. Macris, I would not be so familiar with you as one of my bosses.
well, all right. But then if you were to say, Alex, you don't see color. Why do you say I don't see color? Well, color doesn't exist. But I can perceive color. And I feel the same way about free will, right? Like, you'll encounter many people who will say free will doesn't exist. And I think to myself, well, I know that's not true because I have the subjective volitional experience of free will. So what I've decided now is when someone tells me that free will doesn't exist, I say, I believe that you don't experience free will. And I'm sorry for that. It's like being colorblind to volition.
Here's what I say. I say, I unfortunately believe in free will, but I have no choice over the matter. If I were able to freely choose not to, I would certainly side with you. But the arrangement of atoms in my head makes that impossible. Nobody gets it. Nobody understands what I'm saying. It's amazing to me.
I opt for the simpler option of just saying, clearly you're insane. And why should I take you seriously? Because you don't arrive at any of your... None of your conclusions are arrived at rationally, so I don't care what you think.
Yeah.
I like your answers better. Your answers are more fun.
It's the theory that eliminates the theoretician. It's the philosophy that eliminates the philosopher.
Well,
I once had a lengthy and rather acrimonious, I'm afraid to say, debate with a physicist who I rather admired. It's a guy whose ideas I used in one of my science fiction books. He's a very advanced thinker. And he got into a conversation with me saying that he could prove God existed by means of empirical methods. He was going to build a machine that proved God existed. And I asked him a few questions about how he was going to do this, what the machine would measure, and why he thought that any atheist would look at his evidence if it had come about. And he announced to me that as a metaphysical proposition that there was no such thing as metaphysics, And speaking as a physicist, he could tell me, a philosopher, that philosophy did not exist. All of its roles and functions had been superseded by physics. So that every philosophical question could be answered by physics. And I said, very politely, I said, do you mean that if I have a philosophical question, including the question of whether or not philosophy exists, you can answer it by means of an observation or an experiment? Because if you have discovered philosophy does not exist, tell me the experiment, and I will perform it myself and be convinced by it. And he said, it's amazing to me that you're so irrational that you think you know more about science than I do. He then waved his credentials in my face and told me what chair he was in the university. Now, he was making a tyro mistake, a philosophy 101 mistake. If you make the metaphysical argument that metaphysics does not exist, you're making an argument about the nature of the substance of reality. Let's say you're making an argument about metaphysics. If you're making a non-observational argument, an argument not based on empiricism, that philosophy does not exist, that's a philosophical stance. That's a philosophy argument, okay?
Right.
I could not get through to him, and he was not willing to remain polite with me. It was amazing to me. And this is a guy. This is a logical thinker. This guy was on the ball. Yeah. And so I thought, there's a spirit involved here. There's a type of hypnosis. It's like talking to someone who has stared into the eyes of the hypnotoad. You know? It's just odd.
Yeah. Ayn Rand calls it the fallacy of the stolen concept. She was the first person I encountered who ever identified that, right?
Which is sad, because I think she herself indulges in that fallacy. she's a scholastic Aquinian, a Thomist, without giving Thomas any credit for her belief in the unity and rationality of the universe. But I like her. Don't get me wrong.
She gives Aquinas credit. I found out about the existence of Aquinas from Ayn Rand.
My mistake.
She calls him the second greatest philosopher after Aristotle.
My mistake.
It's literally how, as a 16-year-old, I learned that dude even existed.
I am ashamed that I badmouthed the poor woman, because I have great admiration for her. She's the only person I know who invented her own theory of how to write a book, and then wrote a book according to that theory, and it was good. So.
Yes, right? The romantic, realistic manifesto, right?
Right.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. Yeah.
As you can see, I used to be a libertarian, and then I had kids.
Then you grew up. Why would she?
Yes.
Right. I remember your essay you wrote, actually, for me, when you said why I'm no longer a libertarian. I remember it was a good essay.
Yeah. It's a little sad, because libertarian was such a nice, simple answer to all of life's ills. You had a hammer and everything looked like a nail. And even now, I have to say, 90% of everything she says is correct, and 90% of our problems are nails, not screws. You know, but you need a screwdriver to install a screw. And I got to say, that 90%, the mere human evil that she spoke of, and she was a better analyst of what caused evil than almost anyone I've ever seen. She was 100% correct about what was motivating the bad guys, which was, in her words, they don't want you to live; they just want to die themselves. They just want you to die.
Yep, the seraphic evil. Yep.
Right, but then you have to take one more step. Why would any organism that was alive engender within itself a desire to cease living? Or for the society around it, on which its life support is based, to cease? That, I think you need to talk about values at that point, and I mean spiritual values. I mean whether or not you believe in the good, the true, and the beautiful, whether you prefer life to death. Why there's something rather than nothing. You have to get philosophical.
Can I note? Can I note? I really hate that word values.
As you should.
Because it's a
weasel word.
It's the good. Damn it! It's the true, the good, and the beautiful, and you're either for it or against it. We don't have values.
Values is one of those words I hate that word. Values is one of the words invented by the enemy, so that they don't have to say the word virtue.
Yes.
Because otherwise they would look ridiculous when they say, my virtue is to be unvirtuous. My virtue is sexual incontinence and unchastity. Lying is one of my virtues. I also place a very high. Also have a very great virtue that makes me. There's a line from a recent movie called Gladiator, where the Commodus, the son of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, says, I also have virtues, Father. They're just not the ones in your book. And, of course, the virtues in the Father's book were fortitude, prudence, justice, and temperance. But they all good virtues, like ambition and crushing my enemies. It's a great line.
Yes.
That's why they use the word values, because the word values is value neutral. It's also a lie. That's also, by the way, why I also use he for the pronoun if you don't know the sex of the antecedent, and why I only use the word gender to refer to parts of speech, and why I don't adopt any of their vocabulary. None of their vocabulary creeps into my language. And I'm sorry that I said the word value when I meant virtue.
It's okay.
But I said it only because Mr. Macris said it, because that's what they said when they were describing their loyalty to Moloch.
Yes.
They're not loyal to... Those guys weren't loyal to Mammon. They would have gone for the money if they had been.
Ayn Rand uses the word value a lot, so she regularly deploys that.
Because she thinks it's man-made.
We were talking
That's
about
okay.
her, so
because she thinks it's man-made. She thinks the value is something you as a human decide to adopt, which is not psychologically possible. It's something you discover. It's a virtue is something you discover. Well, you discover that courage is beautiful, even if it doesn't not necessarily to your advantage.
Well, that's
or justice.
Inevitably that's it, isn't it? Are things discovered or invented, and the divide is they think it's all invented. So,
but they have to, because they don't believe in consciousness in physics or anywhere else. You see what I'm saying? You have to in order to believe that there are mental artifacts like virtues that exist independently of mankind. You have to posit that there's a universal mind in which these things can exist.
Right. So I tend to take the belief that, and this is Aristotelian rather than Platonic, let's say, which is that I think those virtues are instantiated in specific instances rather than existing in a Platonic realm of forms. And so, and I think that therefore they are objective yet agent relative. So for instance, the beautiful is actually something that exists, but what is a beautiful horse versus a beautiful human being versus a beautiful flower is entirely different instantiations of that, right? So that so as I said, this is a very Aristotelian versus instead of Platonic point of view. And I think Christianity has, other than Aquinas and his gang, has more been in favor of like the Platonic view of the good, I believe.
Well, once you say that the God exists and the true and the good, the beautiful issue from him, the idea that the beautiful exists as a Platonic form, but has different incarnations. You see, the idea of incarnation is a very Catholic idea, a very Christian idea. But the burning bush could speak as the Word of God, as can Jesus of Nazareth speak as the Word of God. You see what I'm saying? The things are not, or if I could use a worse analogy, the avatars of the great god Vishnu in India are different from age to age, but it's the same God.
Well, I was thinking when you were saying there's different instantiations of beauty, like a beautiful horse is different to a beautiful woman, is beautiful to a different flower, but they all have in common that they approach, each of them approach the perfect instantiation of that form. I mean, even though forms are only instantiated and they don't exist in a separate Platonic realm, there's a perfect circle. Like even though all circles in reality will fall short of the perfect circle. What they are, everything that's beautiful has in common that they're all seeking to approach the perfect instantiation of whatever they are. So
each a beautiful flower is beautiful because it's more flower-like. It
exactly
its own nature.
Yes.
And a beautiful horse is more horsey,
Yes.
And so on.
Well, so we have only like 11 minutes, but I think if we just keep talking, we can probably solve this philosophical debate in probably like 6 more minutes.
I believe we can, but I also believe that the Holy Roman Catholic Church does not forbid Platonists or Aristotelians from approaching Christ for possible salvation. But I do think our society
I can't believe they let those stinking Platonists in.
No, they let the Platonists in and the Neoplatonists. In fact, even Aquinas himself, belay that, even Thomas Aquinas, is not an official... He's highly regarded by the Church, but not everything he says is doctrinal, is canon,
Right.
Now, you can disagree with Thomas Aquinas if you want, but why would you want to? But I do have to say that a little more Aquinas would be really useful right now in our society, as would a little more St. Francis of Assisi. We need a few crazy beggars as well as a few more logicians to set our society back on track.
So you said
think
earlier,
it's too far gone? Do you think it's going to collapse? Because the people seem so crazy. Just look at the the anecdote
I think it's too far gone.
Mr. Rennie just said about putting a rapist into the woman's prison so he could prey on them, or into the women's center where women go to avoid being abused by men, and then you just unleash a predator on them, like throwing a shark into a bathtub full of babies. I mean, how do we get out of this insanity?
Oh, so you're asking, are we too far gone? Is collapse inevitable?
Yes.
I guess my take is, yeah, we are too far gone, and I think the collapse is already here, right? The collapse is happening. Like, if you think about the finale of Atlas Shrugged, was like the terrible train wreck that kills Eddie.
Yeah.
Where he's trapped, right?
Very
near the finale.
Eddie lives. Eddie is
still
abandoned on a train and looks at the train, and he can't get it in motion again. He's abandoned in the desert.
Yes.
The train wreck was different.
But the train derailment, right? And the big and the what's happening today, right? Or like
train derailments.
New York loses power is right at the climactic finale. Well, what are we having around the country? Rolling brownouts, etc. So like, people keep waiting for like this moment when it's like, oh, well, now it's finally happened. And I don't think there's going to be that moment any more than there was that moment for instance, for Rome, right? Like by the time the Western Roman emperor was deposed, like it didn't matter.
No one even in real life, no one even noticed. They just put in another guy. They just didn't call him emperor, but it was the same. He was doing the same job.
Yeah, no one even noticed.
No one even
exactly. And the way, but what you actually noticed, what you actually see is if you look at shipwrecks in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th century AD, you see that the amount of shipwrecks precipitously goes down because all of the international commerce that had been sustained by the Pax Romana has collapsed. Yeah. So like you can see it in the archaeological evidence, which is amazing because, of course, the last 30 years of historians have been trying to tell us that the Dark Ages never happened. But now the archaeologists are like, well, actually, it totally did. And you can just see it. So I think that's where we are now, right? Like, we're already in the Dark Ages. The question is just how bad is it going to get and what's the new age that's going to emerge?
That was my question. Where is the bottom for this? Well, I mean, I would note on the Dark Ages, I guess the point was when they were saying there wasn't a Dark Age, well, there wasn't a time of extreme superstition where all knowledge was lost. Like these stories that are told and this image of the Dark Ages was never correct. Like it was never like the way the Enlightenment thinkers wanted to portray the Dark Ages. Even if international commerce collapsed like you observed, that's not quite the same thing. Well, it's not quite what was portrayed.
And also there was the fact that Islam took over Egypt and cut off all the grain from Rome was a reason why no one's sending boats that way anymore.
Yeah, well, Islam, I mean, there's a whole argument that the actual cause of the Dark Age collapse was Islam basically severing the Mediterranean in half and cutting off the supply of trade. But, there was a collapse in knowledge. And the folks that created this whole late antiquity, no radical changes, they just have been proven wrong by recent archaeology. Okay. You can see it in the shipwrecks. You can see it in the destruction of books by measuring the size of libraries that existed over time. And you're like, 200,000 books, 100 books.
You can also see it, and I, of course, am a big fan of the Middle Ages because that's when my team was in charge. But you can also see it in the difference between our knowledge of Julius Caesar and our knowledge of King Arthur. King Arthur is a mythical figure, and he comes after Julius Caesar. So the lamps did go out, but it was not. But on the other hand, I think Mr. Rennie is correct that it's not this romanticized idea that superstition won the day. It was mostly an economic collapse, and the politics fell apart. And when that happens, your number of books goes down, and so on and so forth. Yeah,
it was economic and technological.
Yep, that's fair.
But they came back. They recovered, and the Christian Church was still intact, and lasted until the year 1500 when it shipwrecked. If I can just be a little Catholic for a moment. And Christianity is still the dominant religion today, and still the fastest spreading one, even though Islam is giving them is rushing a very close second.
That's not quite.
But the
hang on,
communists.
No, it's fine.
Yes.
I was going to say, Islam isn't. I mean, they say Islam is the fastest growing religion. Islam pops out the most babies. That makes it the fastest growing. But I have read numerous times of various Muslim leaders in Africa complaining bitterly about the fact that they have the highest birth rate, but they don't hold adult converts. They keep doing irritating things like converting to Christianity. So
Mary has appeared to many Muslims, and it's not reported in the news, and they convert. I mean, our Mary, as an apparition, as a supernatural event. Now, if you're trying to look at the war, the culture war, as a non-supernatural event, you can't explain things like that. You have to just think those people all simultaneously went crazy, and all went crazy in the same direction, in the same way, to the same result. But even so, even if Islam is faster growing by way of population rather than by way of conversion, communism was really quick growing in terms of how much of the world it conquered ever since when Marx took pen to paper. And we can call it different things. We can call wokeness different things. But it's basically communism. It's basically Marxism as applied to social problems as opposed to economic problems.
Sure.
And it's basically religion. And I'm really pleased to hear many people calling it a religion these days. I used to be the only one I knew who said, this is a religion, this is a death cult. You know?
Yeah.
So, I do think the collapse is upon us, but I also think there's that the example of the return of light that the old gods have beaten before should give us some cause for hope. I always think that we should, if we repent in sackcloth and ashes and get on our knees in prayer, we can pray for our country and get some help. And Tucker Carlson agrees with me, I should say. He said in his speech, his speech that he gave at the Heritage Foundation, that we should all take 10 minutes to pray. And he was fired immediately, like that, for bringing up a supernatural event. Now, is that a coincidence? What do you think? Mr. Macris, what do you think? Coincidence?
That I can't say, but so I'll probably annoy some Christians with the following statement, but I will say it. So I actually think that the Christian belief that prayer is the answer is part of why Christianity is losing. Because if you go back and you look at the time period when Christianity spread, right? Go back and read the contemporary accounts of Constantine the Great and his glorious military victories. And you can read them. And the Christian writers at the time, the church fathers, are saying, God has personally endowed Constantine the Great with, the victorious majesty of his way, and he will lead us to battle, and by this sign we conquer, and amen. And all talk of we're going to get there by praying is tossed out the window, and the whole church rallies behind Constantine. That's
ahistorical. That's ahistorical. He was fighting with Mezentius in order to. He was going to get the throne, and only after his.
Read the writers. I've literally read the writers. I'll send you a 900-page PhD dissertation that demonstrates this, which I have read.
Can I?
I mean, it's not ahistorical. So Christianity spread by the sword under Constantine. That is what won Christianity the empire. And if you look and you go back and you look in the 15th century when the conquistadors were heading into South America, which is today one of the largest segments of Catholicism, that you go back again, you read their writings, you read what the Pope of the time said, and he's like, amen, go kick ass, kill the demon worshippers, convert them to Christianity, you're doing God's work.
He also said that they're human and had souls, which not everyone agreed at the time.
Yes, he did say that. I'm not saying that Christians were evil. What I'm saying is that we were muscular.
Constantine won a political battle, and most of his men were Christian in the military at the time. And he later said God had granted him the victory, and he did see a sign, and God did grant him that victory. But that victory was not Christianity versus paganism. That victory was Mezentius versus Constantine to see who would be the emperor. And having a Christian emperor certainly did a lot to spread the prestige of the Christian church. Yes.
See, this is where I disagree and where the church writers at the time disagreed. It was Christianity versus paganism. That was how it was seen at the time. That was how it was pitched at the time. Maxentius even says so when he talks about the threat of the God that Constantine is serving. And the Christians at the time celebrated it as the victory of Christianity over paganism.
Okay.
So this is where I disagree, as I said, with all contemporary Christians, which is Christianity of old was a muscular religion, right?
Oh, you get no argument from me on that
agree.
point. I
It
think
was
the
a
Christians these
muscular
days
religion.
are.
Right, you read the
very-
gospel. Oh, sorry, you read the prophecies of Saint Bridget and the revelations of Saint Bridget, and Saint Bridget literally says the knight is holier than the monk because all the monk does is pray, but the knight goes out and fights and dies for God. Right now, you cannot find a pastor or a priest in America today who will say something like that.
I will say something like that. So there, on that point, you get no argument from me whatsoever. I just think I just think you can't drive your car without gas in it. Without prayer, you don't have the ability to influence the unseen spirits who are the real enemy.
I was going to say, yeah.
I'm not saying that prayer isn't necessary. I'm saying prayer is not sufficient. You are filling up the gas tank, but we never get in the car.
Well, hang on.
Oh, I agree.
No, I think, I
absolutely agree. Look, I'm a Catholic. 14 of our saints are military saints. I believe in St. George. I believe Santiago. I believe that St. James the Moor Slayer is supposed to unsheath the sword of Christ to drive back the pagans. Because for one thing, the modern pagans can't be reasoned with. Okay, so you can't convert them by means of debate.
And yet,
and they won't stop, and they won't retreat.
There's just fascinating amounts of books have been written. Because as I said, I went into this deep dive on theodicy and evil and struggle, and you cannot find a book written in the 21st century of any Christian denomination, right, which can say anything other than embarrassment at any of the muscular Christianity of the past. They're embarrassed by it. They try and cover it up. They try and explain it away. They were mistaken. And it's a strict argument of nonviolence and total pacifism. And that's coming from every source today.
That's really sad, because one reason why I became a Catholic is because they had King Arthur on their side and all those knights who were, pretty manly men who did a lot of butchery with their swords.
Can you imagine Pope Francis declaring a crusade? I cannot. It's not even conceivable to me.
I have tried to declare a crusade. I did a lecture series called The Last Crusade, which I recorded and is being put up on a video, because I think that we should decree a crusade and take up arms against these enemies who have taken up arms against us. I do think we should abide by the just war theory of Thomas Aquinas.
We should.
But you didn't answer the question. Can you imagine Pope Francis, the leader of the Catholic Church?
No. Yeah, I mean, hang on. This will be saying it too strongly, but I can't imagine Pope Francis being Catholic, so...
That's
a little bit stronger than I intend, but...
Wow. I was going to...
There are a lot of... There are a lot of people that do not... I have seen more than a few comments to the effect of we should pray for Pope Francis that he is converted to Catholicism.
Let's give the anti-pope his due, however.
So
while he did put idols into the Vatican, he just this week gave a speech where he said that gender ideology is blasphemously wrong and against Catholic teaching, and that aborticide is wrong and against Catholic teaching, and homosex. I was amazed. I couldn't believe it was the real Pope Francis.
So do you think? So you made a joke there, but do you think Francis is the?
I think.
No, I think that his personal opinion interferes with his professional, his mandate from heaven.
I don't think. Well, I think history will decide that. I don't think it's reasonable of me to make such a declaration. God has seen fit to put him in that position, and he may have been put in that position as a judgment on the church, and we will see things change and things go back in a saner direction when he's gone. Maybe, I don't know, but it's not really for me to say. But yeah, who knows? I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. How's that?
Let me answer the question technically as a failed lawyer. He's not an anti-pope because the College of Cardinals did not erect another pope to say that he should be pope. And despite my brothers in Christ who think that the retirement of the previous pope was not legally valid, I believe, as best I could tell from reading the canon law, it was legally valid. So he is actually officially the pope. Yeah. But as a faithful son of the Catholic Church, I retain the right to complain about my boss. Everyone bellyaches about his boss. Every soldier in the church militant sometimes complains about the commanding officer.
He could certainly be.
Sorry,
He could
that's
certainly be
part of war.
He could certainly be a very
Sure,
bad pope.
sure.
I mean, we've had those before, so you know, like
Yeah, I mean, I personally do know Catholics who absolutely believe that he is not the real pope, but those folks also genuinely believe that that's been true since essentially Second Vatican, and that the entire movement abrogated their.
Hey, I met a guy who didn't believe that the Nicene Council was correctly decided, and thought that he should go off and make his own ancient church. That he thought that.
I gotta say, I have sympathy for such people, right? Like, I'm reading all this theology, and I'm like, some of these guys, this is good. They erred here. I'm going to create my own, and it's I just don't want to lose all my Catholic friends, so I've held off.
it's a.
Well,
but I mean,
the advantage of being Catholic is you can see our church being mismanaged for 2,000 years, and still is here and still is spreading. So believe it or not, there's a lot of bishops in Africa who believe in the Catholic Church. I don't know if there's any bishops in America who do. Excuse me, I'm gonna get in so much trouble for saying that.
There are some. I mean, I forget who said it. It's like,
tell me the name of a single Catholic church that stayed open during COVID, and then I will say that there are still saints working in America. Because I've seen such bravery in China. I've seen such bravery elsewhere, but not here.
I agree. My local churches went along with that and went to doing things online, and I was very disappointed. So
that's another reason why I think with Mr. Macris that this is a spiritual war, because they went after the churches and kept the bars and whorehouses open. Mm-hmm. Why would they single out the church?
That's a really good data point. Like, why do that?
Yeah. Why go out of your way? Now, if it was really them trying to disarm us by getting rid of the Second Amendment, so we would turn into a pest hole like Australia. No offense.
That's fair.
That I could understand. That I could understand being done for materialistic reasons. That just seems like normal communism. But to go after the church and to start demanding that the church no longer preach against sexual misbehavior, that looks spiritual to me. That looks like the devil's behind it. And one reason why I think it's also spiritual is because I've seen the pattern of behavior is longer than a human lifespan.
Yep.
I don't believe any conspiracy could start in the late Victorian age and still be operating along the same lines with the same tactics, unless there was a creature that is longer lived than human beings that's behind it. Now, that may just be my paranoia.
Whether that's true or not, I think it's historical evidence that there has been a conspiracy of sorts since the Victorian era, right? Like, Carol Quigley traces it all out for us, all the way back to the late Victorian era, and tracks it, and had access to the records and documented it all in the book Tragedy and Hope. So then, it raises the question, well, if we can't keep anything secret in the White House because everything gets leaked, yet somehow we've been able to have this 125, 150-year conspiracy, it does make you go,
One drawback, if you do decide to become Catholic, is that we are enemies of the Freemasons. And because they are actually a conspiracy that's actually been around since the earlier centuries.
So, funnily enough, John, back when we were running everyjoe.com, one of my writers, apart from you, was actually a Freemason. And so he was absolutely outraged and angry that I had you writing for the website, because he was like, these people hate my religion. They've almost destroyed us multiple times. And I'm like, whoa, bro, I'm running a men's comedy website. I ain't getting in between the Freemason Catholic war front, right? Like, we're just not going there. But yeah, he was pretty profoundly upset about it.
You arranged a debate between me and a friendly atheist who turned out to be not so friendly after all. People of different opinions. When the spirits are not involved, people of different opinions can get along for our mutual benefit for running a humor website, for example. You see,
right.
But when spiritual warfare is involved, everything's involved. As someone smarter than I, and there are many people, once said, every other war is about something, but a religious war is about everything, because you're fighting about your entire worldview. You're fighting about your fundamental belief about reality, about mankind, about destiny, about everything gets involved.
Yeah.
And because in this case, the enemy is trying to attack us at every point, in every way, on every topic. That's why that's the other reason why I think it's spiritual.
Right. And, it's funny you brought that up, because a lot of, even me, I fell prey to this, we liken the current state of America to the fall of Rome or whatever. But I actually think the closer example is where Europe just before the 30 Years' War, where there are two opposed faiths that each believe that the other is completely wrong and in the service of evil, and they are prepared to fight about it. They are preparing to fight about it. And when you look at the 30 Years' War, that was a total war. Something like 20% of the population of Germany dies in the 30-Year War. It's a bloodbath. And they just keep killing each other until both sides realize they can't win, and so they finally agree, well, I guess we should have religious toleration. But that, it comes after 30 years of butchery. And I think hundreds of years later now, we've forgotten that. And now we're back at that stage where we're like, I guess we're just going to have to butcher each other until either one side wins or we realize we should tolerate each other.
I've thought that the First Amendment was an armistice between the denominations.
It's an armistice. That's right. It's an armistice.
You're more optimistic than I am, because I don't think our side is even aware there's a war going on. Some of them are, but right. I hear occasional rumblings, and I do hear about people who wish the fighting would start. But so far
I'm
the
using
only
fighting
side that's
metaphorically here in this case, but yeah, I hear.
Okay.
It may cease being metaphorical soon enough.
Well, we've had race riots. I mean, for 2-3 years running. I'm old enough to remember them from the '60s. It was the same group of people for the same reason. No, I was young, but I remember it. I remember the moonshot too.
I had a buddy who was in law school who was one of the rooftop Koreans during the L.A. riots.
Wow.
Nice.
Wow.
Yeah, so he was up on the top of the roof with guns defending his dad's shop.
It occurs to me that if this is not a spiritual war, we should make it so that we can get the angels on our side to help us out in situations like that. Because I'd hate to be alone on a roof with a gun with an entire mob of. Well, it's bribing the umpire, so yeah, that's cheating. But let's win.
So
cheating by prayer.
Well,
they can do it too if they want to get down on their knees and pray to our God rather than to. I heard a story of a priest who was on a plane who was seated next to a witch, and he didn't have his collar on. She didn't know he was a priest, and she said, "Oh, I'm fasting today because I'm trying to gather spiritual energy for praying in favor of abortion. Our dark Father below loves that sort of thing." And it wasn't honest to gosh, it was an honest to goodness witch,
Wow.
And not one of those nice witches. It was one of the bad witches who are, as we all know, only good witches.
At one point when I was working in media, I was invited to join the Church of Satan. They sent a recruiter out to ask me to join. So, and he was like, "Well, listen, we downplay it, but the magic is real, right? We do the rituals." Like, it was pretty interesting. I was like,
right.
He drove a red Lamborghini. Satanism had been good to him. So
the prince of this world rewards those who serve him in this world until he destroys them. Yeah.
So,
I mean, if you're going to be just me personally, if I was going to be on the losing side of a religious war, I'd rather be a Viking, because that way, even though I'm going to die at the last battle,
you get to go to Valhalla.
I'll be there with Odin and Thor. I mean, come on, those guys are cool, especially if they're played by Chris Hemsworth.
Yeah. Well, it's like you saw the Patriarch Kirill of the Russian Orthodox Church when the war in Ukraine started. He made an announcement that all Russian soldiers who die in Ukraine are martyrs for the faith and go to heaven. Right? You haven't seen an announcement like that in 1,000 years.
Wow. So, I did not hear that. Yeah. I'm impressed.
Well, they are at war with Clown World. So, on that note, we've been talking for probably over an hour at this point. Final thoughts. What can we do? You were critical of prayer, Mr. Macris, but it seems like a good place to start, just not a good place to finish.
Yeah, I mean, now I'm going to be that guy, right? Like, I'm not critical of prayer. I pray myself. Sometimes, since I'm still sort of in my theologically searching phase, sometimes I'm not quite exactly sure how I'm supposed to pray, but I do pray. But I just don't think it's
I agree. No.
May I make a suggestion? I make this suggestion in all seriousness. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray, and do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all the evil spirits who prowl around the world seeking the ruin of souls. Saint Michael is a military saint. He's in charge of the armies of heaven. He's the prince of the hosts, the magister militum in Roman terms.
I love Michael. I actually have some heretical views on Michael that I won't share here because I've probably already gotten myself in enough trouble. So, but Michael the Archangel is fantastic.
You think you're going to get in more trouble than I am with my boss for saying that the Pope?
All right. Well, I mean, I'll say it then.
Oh no! Don't offend our viewer, our three viewers.
Okay.
Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. What do you think, Jason? Should he say it or should he be polite?
He can say it. That's fine.
All right. So my view is, I think that Michael is a Christophany. So that is to say, before Jesus took the form of man, Jesus was in the form of Michael, which is not to say that Jesus is a created angel, which is the heresy that some faiths believes, but rather I believe that both the angel of the Lord and Michael are Christophanies of Christ before he became human, because I don't think before he became human he was sitting around doing nothing. I think he was actively doing God stuff, and he was, as the person who incarnates, he incarnated as Michael, an angel. He incarnated as the angel of the Lord. And I think that's why we see in Revelations that Jesus is in charge of the heavenly host, but we also read that Michael's in charge of the heavenly host, and you're like, well, that's weird. Do they have a divided chain of command? Are they divided into Coast Guard and Army? Like, what's going on? Like, no, it's the same dude. So that's my heretical take on Michael.
I don't think that's necessarily any more heretical than my belief that the burning bush was also Christ. I mean, I believe Christ was a vegetable, and I also think he can turn into a loaf of bread. So I'm not gonna argue with you on that point theologically.
So yeah, I mean that would be a good point, right? Like the burning bush, right? Was that a Christophany? You know.
Well, he's the Word of God, and he's the active principle of the Father that makes the world. If you see what I'm saying, he's actually the creator.
Right.
So. I'm not. Yeah. I myself, being a little bit of a blasphemer myself, I'm not going to try to place limits on what I think Christ can and cannot do.
Yeah, and there's a really interesting thing. So if you look, there's this passage in the Bible, I believe it's in Daniel, and it says, and it's translated as, and then Michael, one of the chief princes, came down. And everybody says, well, look, we know Michael's not Christ because he's just one of the chief princes. And obviously that's not what Jesus says. But it's actually, if you go back and you look at the original ancient Greek of that phrase, it could be translated equally well as first of the chief princes, not one of the chief princes, because one and first could be grammatically indistinguishable in certain cases. And so in which case it's saying that Michael is the first of all. He's the head of everybody, the chief of chiefs. Oh, king of kings. Just saying.
The prince of the heavenly host, as I just named him.
Yeah, exactly. So that's my take. So like if I ever start a denomination, it's going to be like Catholicism or Orthodoxy, but Michael is also Christ, because Michael's awesome. He runs around with a sword, kicks ass. Like another thing, right, is you think about it, you're like, okay, we're specifically told that Lucifer was the greatest of the angels, right?
Yep.
And yet we're also told that Michael personally beat him in combat and threw him out of heaven. Well, that doesn't jive. If Lucifer was the greatest of the angels, why did Michael beat him? And for that matter, why didn't Jesus beat him? Like, is Jesus just chilling out, being like, hey, Michael, I'm busy today. You know, can you step over to line 7 and deal with Satan?
Well,
like, no.
Let me just put in an ad for the Catholic Church. It occurs to me that instead of starting your own denomination, where your tradition of Michael worship is going to only go back to Tuesday, if you join with us, we have many lovely pictures and even statues of the great Prince of the Heavenly Hosts. And
right.
There's thousands of books to read. Some have not been translated yet, touching on all of these very deep philosophical and theological topics. And we're actually, fun people, except when we're in hair shirts and whipping ourselves.
But you could, and you could start,
Well,
you could start your own
order.
That's the word I look for. Yeah, there
Order.
you go.
Yeah,
See?
totally, right?
Right.
We have space for
So
it.
like the Benedictines, the Franciscans, and the Macrisians.
I mean, I wouldn't name it after myself, but yeah, I'm bringing Michael back. It's like,
And that could also
bringing sexy back.
That could also be a good rock song,
Bring-
bringing Michael back. Yeah. So
I'm bringing Michael back. Even the name means who is like God.
Yeah.
Right. Like it's like they're giving us a big hint. Like who's like God? No one, because he's God. Ergo.
I will consult with my father confessor and report you to the Inquisition, which still exists, by the way. You think we Catholics are
See, I
are
knew I
wimpy.
shouldn't have said anything, right?
No. But we have legalistic hearings about these things, and after 100 years or two, they'll come to a decision. So,
I just listen. If someone shows up in a red robe and starts torturing me, I'm blaming you.
hey, no. We turn things over to the secular arm for that. All we
Yep.
do is have a legal hearing as to whether it's orthodox or heterodox. So.
All right. Well, if I get swatted over this, I'm blaming you then.
All right.
I blame Tim Pool. I'm sure he's causing most of the swatting because it always happens to him. So he must be the
Oh
cause
my
of it,
God.
right? Wait, which tactic was that? Blaming the victim for what you yourself did.
Yeah.
Which one was that called?
Yeah.
So
The ricochet effect? I can't remember.
we do need to bring this to a close, guys.
So now I've revealed my dark heresy. So I guess everyone knows. Yeah.
It's kind of a sweet heresy. We all like Michael.
Yeah.
Come on.
So on that note, we do need to bring this to an end. So thank you for joining
right.
us today, Alexander Macris. Where can people find more of your work if they're interested?
I have two different blogs. One is called Arbiter of Worlds. It's at arbiterofworlds.substack.com. That is my politics-free gaming and comic blog where I just nerd out on things. And I don't get into a lot of political commentary even about pop culture there. And then secondly, I have treeofwoe.substack.com, which is my political and philosophical blog, where I avoid talking about current events in order to talk about really obscure philosophical and political issues that no one's heard of.
Is that a reference to the Conan scene in Comes a Witch, the Tree of Woe?
Yes, it is.
I hope I get street cred from you for recognizing the reference.
Oh yeah, this is so I love this blog because I write this blog and it's my Conan themed blog where it's like my personal diary of thoughts. And people take it super, super seriously, and they're like, and I'll write an essay, and they'll be like, I can't believe that you didn't address this particular footnote of this particular concept in this particular book that no one has ever read. And I'm just like, bro, I'm really sorry that my Conan-themed blog isn't meeting your standards of academic excellence, right? Okay, I don't know what else to say. I'm really sorry.
Okay.
Before we hang up, do you agree with me that Belit is the girl for Conan? That she was actually the woman that he was meant for? I'm shipping them.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Okay.
Well,
For sure, it was after her death, Conan's a changed dude.
Yeah.
well, on that note, thank you for joining us today, Alexander, and I hope everybody enjoyed that. Like, share, and subscribe, and we'll be back next time. Thanks for listening.